Part of the Lives of Animals research group. That is led by Dr. Alison Warka, who's an animal geographer. She was formerly in the geography idea of wildlife tourism in the news as of recently. So in 2015, National Geographic published an article covering research coming out of Oxford University of a group that examined 24 types of wildlife tourism globally. And they plotted these tourism attractions in terms of their welfare and conservation impacts for animals. What they found that of the 24 types, only 6 were good for animals in terms of their welfare and conservation. And so what that meant was approximately 500,000 animal individuals worldwide in tourism are in an attraction that compromises their welfare, conservation, or both. Out of that group as well, in 2017, there was an article published again in National Geographic that looked at wildlife ecotourism in Manaus, Brazil, which is the Amazon. And you would think ecotourism meaning ethical, humane animal practices, but because ecotourism isn't globally regulated, they found that actually it was what you might call selfie tourism. The animals were held in poor captive environments without enrichment, possibly being captively bred or taken from the environment. This was just a preliminary scope, so there's a lot more questions than answers, but it didn't look very good for the title of ecotourism. So World Animal Protection, which was formerly the WSPCA, is involved in this research, and they have published the Wildlife Selfie Pledge, which I encourage people to sign. Essentially, it says that you won't take a selfie, meaning that you'll be in such a close encounter with an animal that is part of a performance tourism act or held captive in some way. Instagram now has a alert bubble that pops up if you search the hashtag for some sort of wild animal selfie, which is pretty interesting, and you can actually click and learn more, and on their website there'll be information about the wildlife trade and inhumane tourism attractions. And following suit, TripAdvisor now stopped selling tickets to what they deem cruel wildlife attractions, typically animal performances, wild animal riding, etc. So I want to take a closer look at the first article I mentioned because this is where the inspiration for my research comes from. So this is the graph where the authors Morehouse et al. Graphed 24 types of wildlife tourism in terms of their very good conservation scores and very good welfare scores. And what you can see is that the only tourism attractions that had positive valences for welfare and conservation were sanctuaries, and one was gibbon watching, quite randomly. So my research tries to understand how wildlife ecotourism can depend on animals, but why don't the lives and the experiences of animals individually focus in the scholarship on wildlife ecotourism? So my research approach is very interdisciplinary. I'm combining conservation science and studies, tourism scholarship, animal studies, mostly animal geography because my supervisor is a geographer, and my background is animal welfare research coming from the University of Guelph, where I was a research assistant there. And just to clarify, because animal welfare can mean the philosophical study as well, I'm speaking here about animal welfare science. Of course, it's related to the philosophy, but I just wanted to clarify. Animal welfare science is the study of individual animals, and conservation is the study of populations and species. And for decades, they have been considered oppositional to each other because they study totally different foci. But actually now, Mark Beckhoff, who some people might be familiar with, and the Born Free Foundation have created this field called compassionate conservation. And also David Fraser in welfare studies at UBC leads this charge, which is to try and marry the two, welfare and conservation, as two sides of the same coin of animal health and lives. So I thought I'd give some background on animal welfare for those not familiar with the science of it, as it might apply to anyone doing animal geography studies in the audience. So essentially it is considering three major realms: the physical health of an animal, so you can think kind of the medical history; the mental health of the animal, so are they suffering, are they stressed, do they have a happy life, do they experience pleasure; and then the natural environment that they're in. If they're held in captivity, that's typically where animal welfare comes in, and their natural behavior. Currently, there's no one simple measure of animal welfare. And Dr. Georgia Mason at the University of Guelph, who I was a research assistant for, has a great little discussion of it, basically saying that even though you can have all these objective measures of welfare, in the end it is a subjective judgment on an animal that will be influenced by our concern for it and for the animal under consideration. So you can think of how sometimes charismatic species and keystone species are given more priority over others. There's also contention over a standard definition of welfare. So there's two kind of schools of thought within the science. There's the biological functioning school, and this is a definition that suits that, which is that the welfare of an individual is its state as it tries to cope with the environment, and all those coping systems refer to its feelings, so its subjective experience and its health. And then the feeling school of animal welfare is that animal welfare is only poor if an animal is experiencing a negative affective state. So if it's suffering, if it's unhappy, etc. I come from where the feeling school, most animal welfare scholars at Guelph come from this field. And just to maybe clarify with an example, in this school, if an animal has a tumor, for example, but it doesn't know and it leads a happy life and experiences pleasure and is well cared for and doesn't seem to be affected by it, we would say it has good welfare, whether or not it is sick or physically maimed. So some ways to measure animal welfare. You can do a behavioral assessment, so you look at abnormal behaviors. These are typical in captivity. So one of the most common assessments is by looking at animal stereotypies, which is essentially any sort of repetitive behavior that has no clear object or function. So you might think of feather plucking, tail biting, pacing, and other type of study coming out of the feelings group especially is animal preference, which is trying to allow animals to have agency in welfare assessments over deciding what they want. So placing two rewards in front of an animal and seeing which one it's more motivated towards. And the more traditional sense of welfare assessments involve physiological indicators, which I will describe in a moment. So essentially you can assess subjectively. This is a mouse grimace scale used especially in lab testing to assess mouse pain. And then you can do fecal corticosteroid testing to test for stress hormones in an animal during a particularly stressful event. And again, you can observe, for example, this tiger pacing qualitatively to say it probably doesn't have the range capacity and so it's frustrated or bored. And you can quantify that into what's called an ethogram or an activity budget to see what proportion of its day is spent doing these abnormal or objectless behaviors. So my welfare techniques I'm using in my research is body condition scoring because it's non-invasive, and that would be done in conjunction with the veterinarians that are at rescue centers in Costa Rica, and so understanding their medical history and how healthy the animal is physically without doing invasive procedures. And I'll also be doing behavioral observations and creating ethograms to see whether they are performing abnormal behaviors in captivity. And essentially I want to know, are they healthy, do they have a good life, and are they getting what they want? So Costa Rican wildlife rescue centers have not been published on that much at all, especially as sites of ecotourism, even though I believe they are because they follow the tenets of ecotourism in that they occur in a natural environment, they are a chance to observe wild animals, they support conservation efforts, and they support local livelihoods. And just a little bit of a caveat, I'm not sure that all rescue centers support local livelihoods, but the one I went to that was locally owned, definitely employed local people. So my dissertation questions are, to what extent do wildlife rescue centers promote positive welfare and conservation outcomes? How are local livelihoods related to these rescue centers? And how are the lives of primates in rescue centers entangled with those of the locals? And I'll get into that in a bit. And I just wanted to mention, this is a howler monkey on the left and a spider monkey. And I don't think they've ever been seen in the wild together, but they are rescued from the pet trade and they're juvenile individuals, and now the howler monkey has picked up spider monkey traits. So when I first saw it and it was swinging around and going crazy, I was like, is that a new species of spider monkey? It was quite interesting. So that is an example, I think a micro example of an interspecies community that could be interesting to study. So my proposed field sites are 4 different rescue centers across Costa Rica, representing different provincial regulations, just to get a good cross-section. And my methodology is pretty holistic. I'm going to be doing welfare assessments, conservation assessments of animals, and then looking at the human actors. How are the community involved? How do they experience conflict over wildlife? And also I'm interested in how tourists learn at rescue centers, differentially compared to a lot of research that's been done on tourists' experience at zoos. So I thought I'd share some findings from my preliminary site visit this past July. So I visited 3 rescue centers. One was locally operated, the other was owned by American philanthropists with no background in animals whatsoever. This one is operated by like a local veterinarian. And GEOG is the largest rescue center in Costa Rica, and it's operated by the Nature Restoration Foundation. That rhymed. All right, so where do the animals in rescue centers come from? Quite a number come from conflict with humans, which is why I'm interested in how they're entangled in the local community, because in this case, they assumed that a howler monkey had probably entered into someone's private residence and was not welcomed and ended up getting hit with a machete. But I am happy to report that he is released and rehabilitated and living his best life in a forest. The illegal wildlife trade and pet industry is also a source of animals that end up in rescue centers because they can't be released like 90% of the time because they've been habituated to humans or they've been coddled in a way that has affected their natural behavior. And it's really interesting because only 4 years ago, Costa Rica banned keeping wildlife as pets. And one survey I found said that 40% of Costa Rican households had wildlife as pets. So now there's kind of this huge influx of these animals that are being taken from the pet trade, or people are surrendering from being household pets, and they're going into these rescue centers. And also hunting and the wildlife trade was banned in 2012. So these are all pretty recent. Oh, yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. I gotta go to They are also involved in traffic collisions. So this spider monkey lost part of his arm when he was hit by a vehicle and now cannot be released. And this is an issue I did not know about at all until I went there. A lot of the electrical wiring in Costa Rica isn't insulated. So it seems like the majority of animals coming in not from the wildlife trade are actually because they've been electrocuted. So that's a growing issue. So wildlife will receive, the rescue centers will receive the wildlife, and they usually come from either the Ministry of the Environment or from local people who found the animal. Then they're rehabilitated. So there's a veterinarian at the rescue centers. They'll do surgery. They might have to send the animal elsewhere to do something diagnostic like imaging because these are NGOs, so they don't always have the equipment. And then if the animal can be rehabilitated, it'll be quarantined from tourists, volunteers, pretty much anybody except the veterinarian and the clinician, because you don't want to habituate them or put them at risk of disease. And then wildlife are released into a local national park or a wildlife corridor. So this is a little bit of a case study. At Kids Saving the Rainforest, I got some numbers. They receive about 191 animals every year, 103 of which are mammals, representing 25 different species, most commonly primates and possums. The successive release is 38%, and 39% of the animals that are received, they cannot rehabilitate or keep in captivity, so they are euthanized. And the animals that aren't released or euthanized are the ones that stay in captivity at the sanctuaries because they can't be released for various reasons. And I thought I would just mention this is Scarletta the kinkajou. She looks like a primate, but she actually isn't. And she was kept as a pet for 5 years in the daylight, even though she's an arboreal nocturnal species, and it caused her to go blind. And then there's a little bit of ambiguity in her life story, but she was found, ironically, at a pirate-themed bar locally of this rescue center with one eye. A little of a disappointing irony. And now she lives in captivity in the rescue center and lives nocturnally, even though she spent most of her life always being kept awake in the daytime, which shows that those natural behaviors and inclinations are there. So the ecotourism aspect is the site of the animals that are not able to be released. So these are some examples. As volunteers, you can feed wildlife at some rescue centers, others not. And rescue centers are also involved in implementing this as like a makeshift wildlife corridor while they try and pressure the Costa Rican government to insulate the wires. And this is called a monkey bridge. and it's for arboreal species to pass over fragmented habitat and over dangerous roadways. As a volunteer and ecotourist, if you go to a rescue center, the work is not glamorous. I was there for 2 weeks at different ones, and it was all the same, very hard labor, but definitely rewarding. You actually felt like you were making a difference. Cleaning enclosure, making them, maintaining them, making environmental enrichments to improve welfare in captivity, and preparing food for animals. So the rescue centers are all very involved in social media as a tool for educating tourists especially, but also the local community. So this is an example from one of the rescue centers, Proyecto Asís, on their Facebook page, and they actually talk about how they've had 3 sloths come in, but if you come, you won't be able to see them. So they're not, at least from this post, they're not trying to kind of trick you and be like, oh, we have sloths in, and then you come there and you're not allowed to see them because they want to rescue and rehabilitate them. So there's definitely a transparency, which I found really interesting and comforting, looking at the rescue center's social media output. As well, the locally owned one, for sure, because I saw they do outreach with local schools and with local groups to especially educate on why you should surrender your wild pets. And so they constantly have an influx of sloths and primates that are coming in, or if those sloths and primates have reached adulthood or teenagerhood and are unruly and people didn't know, now they have to surrender them. And this is at the really large rescue center, Zoo Ave. I found it more geared towards local people, mostly because all the signs were pretty much in Spanish, and there's no bones about it like this. You're seeing this in a zoo, so they're not trying to paint necessarily a pretty picture. It's very much a picture of rehabilitation and anthropogenic impacts on animals. So these are my lessons. These were unexpected welfare issues I noticed at the rescue centers. One was that I didn't see any wildlife selfie because there's a strict no-touch policy. I didn't see it happening, but I felt like the rescue centers were sometimes a little too trusting of us. Like a few times I would be left alone and I would think, I can walk right into this enclosure and no one would know, right? So I found it interesting how they vetted people and how they trained us as volunteers. There was an issue at one of the rescue centers where they had a shipment of live mice instead of dead mice, which they had ordered to feed a bird of prey. No one was trained on how to do cervical dislocation. No one wanted to do it, and these mice were just existing. And so it was ironically a welfare issue for the mice, and I was kind of worried about that. And also I'm wondering, there's kind of this gray area over the release and post-release monitoring of animals. Obviously, it's very hard to monitor an animal once you release them unless you have a very expensive tracking collar or other sort of microchip. And these rescue centers don't have the funds for that because they are donation-based. And one creative way, Conserving the Rainforest monitors a sloth that they released. They dyed the bottom half of his fur black, so it looks like he's wearing pants. And they released him into a national park, so now when the naturalist guides take tourists coming through the park, they're like, oh, that sloth was released and rehabilitated, and then that opens up a conversation in this different realm of ecotourism to talk about the wildlife trade, to talk about why we shouldn't have them in captivity. Some barriers I noticed to providing good animal care. Oh, time? This is my last slide.
Finish.
Okay, yeah. So some barriers to providing good animal care. This isn't to say that there wasn't good animal care, but I did notice there was a lack of distrust between rescue centers with each other. They seemed very suspicious of the others' operations, probably because they are provincially regulated. They were distrustful of the Ministry of the Environment. Some felt that certain rescue centers were getting primates while the other one wasn't, and there was suspicion as to who was getting what animals and what kinds. And there was also distrust between the tourists that would come to rescue centers that had been sold on it being a sloth sanctuary, and then they get there and there's only 2 sloths, and they've paid thousands. So there was a lot of distrust going along, and there was also a high turnover of volunteers and staff, and not a lot of animal experience. At one of the rescue centers, the longest volunteer there had been there 9 months. He was making all these decisions. I thought he was like a PhD student. He had no university background, no animal education. Before coming in. Not to say he didn't provide good animal care, but I was just kind of shocked to learn that he was the decision maker. So that's what I learned, and that's it.
All right, thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes for some questions. Dr. Shack.
Yes. I guess since you're at an early stage, it's more of a comment on one of the last things that you said about the sloth having pants. basically. I know there is some literature about increased rates of degradation in animals that have had somehow their natural fur change. It increases visibility, which obviously would impact the welfare of these animals. So maybe it's just something to consider while you're doing your
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that because now you're changing their, as you said, their physical appearance. Off the top of my head, just from what I observed, the area they release them in is Manuel Antonio National Park. It's very small and it's fragmented from other wildlife corridors, and it's very pedestrianized. So it's more of like a contained free-ranging area where that's heavily monitored by the government and is gated off. So maybe that's why they released him there and not somewhere else. But that's a really good consideration I'm glad you brought up. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. I enjoyed that. I like the example of the spider monkey and the howler monkey.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder what potential you think these places have for interspecies community. Is it just a glimpse, or is there some more kind of robust potential?
Yeah, that's such a good question because it's something I'm thinking about too, and I think kind of having the animal geography angle from my supervisor could help me understand. Yeah, I was totally shocked. I genuinely was questioning whether any primates at all because the howler, for those that don't know, howlers sit like 20 hours a day in a tree eating kind of like Jabba the Hutt. Not to generalize, but that is more of their behavior. And spider monkeys are the crazy ones that are swinging around like you would think of as a monkey, and that's what the howler was doing. And they were cuddling and comforting each other and playing, which is something you would never see in the wild, at least from my field work in national parks. I think that there's a lot of potential for interspecies communities. I know that you and Sue are both interested in that at the other sanctuary. The issue, I think, is honestly just practical and economical. They were constantly tearing down and putting up new enclosures and just trying to constantly expand the size of them and not having, I think there's this gap where there's volunteers that come there and then they find out that they have to, like we had to drill concrete and then clear it all out in all the brambles, and it was bad. Like we were cut and it was very hard manual labor, unskilled because we weren't trained. I can't imagine the average group doing that are only there for a day. So then they have this labor gap that's preventing them from creating larger enclosures. But there was a lot of species mixing, I noticed. And actually particularly at GEOG, which you might be interested in, that's the largest rescue center, and there's free-ranging animals coming in that just hang out because they were rehabilitated and there's food. And the monkeys could go if they wanted to amongst other monkey enclosures. So I think there's definitely potential, yeah. Thanks.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really interesting. Just curious, to what extent does the rescue center promote is maybe the wrong word, but is it anyway, promote tourism? In other words, locals, you touched on that, but to what extent do they actually advertise the center to tourists from other countries or potentially from faraway regions or whatever, and invite them to come in and promote this? Can you talk about that balance?
From my scoping of the internet and the rescue centers at Costa Rica, the only one I'm sure is local owned is the one I visited, Proyecto Asís. And typically local people who run rescue centers and tourism attractions are sometimes